For more than 1,000 years, the English landscape has been shaped by a profound division, one that still separates the countryside of today into two fundamentally different types. Outside the world of academia, this phenomenon is little known. Very rarely will you find it depicted on modern maps or atlases, and yet it remains crucial to understanding why rural England looks the way it does. What's more, whilst this dividing line is influenced by topography and geology, it is also the result of human actions and decisions from long ago. This division is certainly harder to spot than in the past, but if you know what to look for, the evidence for it can still be seen all around us. Once you know about it, you will never look at the English countryside in quite the same way again. Today, on Deep Down History, we examine England's secret split. Let's begin our investigation by taking a map of Great Britain, and, with apologies to Scotland and Wales, your landscapes have their own story, let's focus in on England. First, we'll draw a line from roughly the Wash, heading along the scarp of the Chilterns southwestwards towards the south coast. Next, we'll draw a second line, cutting across the southwest of England, then heading up the Severn Valley and turning north to skirt the eastern edge of the Pennines. Whilst these lines are admittedly only an approximation, they do divide England into three distinct provinces, one to the southeast, a central province, and another to the north and west. And yet, though we have three provinces, at the most basic level we can allocate them to just two types of countryside. How then do these two types differ? Well, firstly let's begin with the places people live. The central province of England is a land of villages, that is, larger rural settlements where the buildings clump together, in the technical jargon, nucleated settlements. In the outer provinces, to the southeast and to the north and west, the predominant rural settlement forms are hamlets and farmsteads, smaller places more widely spread across the landscape, a pattern known as dispersed settlement. Now, to be clear, this division is one of degree, not absolutes. There are, of course, villages, hamlets and farms to be found all across England, but our concern is with the dominant pattern found in most areas. To demonstrate this split, let's look at the settlements in just two areas, an area near the Thames Valley in the central province, and another in deepest Essex in the southeast zone. To do this, and to avoid the complications of modern developments, we'll use early Ordnance Survey maps from nearly 200 years ago. Our first example is an area of about 5 miles across in the central zone, south of the modern town of Didcot. We can see immediately that the settlement pattern in this area is dominated by a small number of large nucleated villages, with very few buildings in between them. Next, let's switch to an area of central Essex, northwest of Chelmsford. Note that the scale of this map is unchanged and still shows an area of about 5 miles across. Whilst there are a couple of larger settlements, the layout of the landscape here is radically different, being dominated by a dense spread of individual farms and small hamlets. Now, we've looked here at two particularly clear-cut examples of local settlement patterns. Not everywhere in England will fit neatly into one of these two scenarios, but given that nucleated and dispersed settlements do broadly characterise different parts of the country, we might wonder when this divide first came about. The most common view is that the nucleated villages we know today have their origins from the late Anglo-Saxon period onwards, in a span of several centuries either side of the Norman conquest, roughly about AD 850 to 1200. If we delve further back in time, it becomes clear that before this period, dispersed rural settlement was the norm across all of England. Let's start by going back to a time before there was an England, to Roman Britain. Thanks to the visibility and durability of artefacts and building materials in the Roman period, archaeological evidence for settlements at this time is plentiful. We know, of course, that there were some impressive examples of large nucleated settlements in Roman Britain, major cities and towns like London, York and Silchester, as well as smaller defended towns, and a significant number of roadside settlements, for example places such as Roman Staines and Brentford. However, if we move away from the towns and the major road network, a very different picture emerges of Roman Britain and its countryside. To be sure, there were some village-like settlements, but by far the most dominant form of habitation in all areas was the individual farmstead. a minority of these sites could be classed as higher status Roman villas on the basis of the richness and elaboration of their structures and finds, but the great majority were simply working farms. The era of Roman Britain came to an end in the 5th century, eventually giving way to the Anglo-Saxon age, and no doubt this involved much upheaval, but one thing that doesn't seem to have changed was the dominant rural settlement pattern. It was once thought that the typical English village was introduced in the early Anglo-Saxon period by new settlers from the continent, bringing with them the customs of their homeland. However, this view has long since fallen out of fashion. Instead, archaeological evidence has increasingly shown that in early and middle Anglo-Saxon England, the dominant settlement form was once again one of dispersed hamlets and farms. It is true that the excavated plans of some of the longer-lasting settlements of this period can appear to be sizable at first sight. Closer analysis of their dating, though, usually reveals that such sites were relatively small in any one phase, tending to subtly shift position over time as older wooden buildings decayed and new houses were built to replace them nearby. This theme of shifting settlement also applied at a much wider scale in this period, and indeed before. As hamlets and farms were created and abandoned over the centuries, it meant that the locations of settlements often changed, whilst maintaining a scattered pattern. The largely dispersed settlement pattern of early and mid-Anglo-Saxon England does not mean, however, that there were no changes in rural life in this period. Innovations in the mid-Anglo-Saxon period, that is roughly the 7th to 9th centuries AD, included the building of England's earliest churches and the development of important elite centres, sometimes known as Great Hall complexes. Some rural settlements in this period also began to show signs of more deliberate planning in their layout, including more obvious property boundaries. Nevertheless, if we want to find the origins of the English villages of today, we must, for the most part, look to the following centuries, beginning with the later Anglo-Saxon period. This is the time when the long-term location of so many small hamlets began to stabilise, and such settlements began to grow into what we would now recognise as villages. How can we be sure of this? After all, one of the problems with investigating the past archaeology of modern villages is that there are so many existing buildings in the way. There are, of course, some villages that became deserted in the later medieval period, where large-scale excavations are possible. But in order to examine the origins of surviving villages, archaeologists have needed to find new approaches. Perhaps the best method, adopted by many projects in recent decades, involves a form of keyhole archaeology in village gardens. By digging dozens of small test pits, often just a metre square, and examining the date of pottery found in different zones of each village, it is possible to build up a coherent story of how our villages came into being. One such project, which examined villages spread all over eastern England, found relatively little pottery from the early and mid-Anglo-Saxon periods. In contrast, late Anglo-Saxon pottery was present in 70% of villages, and medieval pottery from the centuries after the Norman conquest was found in every nucleated settlement examined. The more detailed results, analysing evidence of habitation over time within each place, also back up this picture. In short, most modern villages began life in the late Anglo-Saxon period and grew into what we would recognise as villages over the following 2 or 3 centuries. We've seen then that the Great Division in the history of England's rural settlements has its origins more than 1,000 years ago. Some areas developed villages, whilst elsewhere the pattern of hamlets and farms continued into the medieval age. But this is only part of the story. The two types of English countryside also differ in the landscape that surrounded these villages, hamlets and farms, both today and in the past. The late great historian of Britain's countryside, Oliver Rackham, called the landscape of the central province of England with its large villages planned countryside. For the southeast, and in the lowland areas to the north and west, that is the area of dispersed settlement, he coined the term ancient countryside. The differences between these two countrysides today can be seen in their fields, hedgerows, woods and lanes. In the planned countryside of central England, fields are usually regular in shape and surrounded by straight, thin hedgerows, often composed of just a few species, including hawthorn. Woodland is less common, but where it occurs tends to be found in large blocks. The landscape is crossed by relatively few roads and footpaths. In the words of Oliver Rackham, upland countryside is a predictable land of wide views, sweeping sameness and straight lines. In contrast, the fields of ancient countryside are often irregular, surrounded by sinuous hedgerows often containing a greater variety of species, including hazel, maple and dogwood. In some cases, these hedgerows are the remnants of former woods. Surviving woodland itself is more plentiful, but typically found in smaller parcels. Ancient countryside is also where you will find most of England's surviving heaths and signs of old wood pastures such as pollarded trees. This is a landscape crossed by a much denser network of winding roads, holloways and footpaths. To quote Rackham again, ancient countryside is an intricate land of mystery and surprise. The differences that we can see today between these two broad landscape types have developed over time, and if anything, the contrast between them was even more pronounced in the past. Observers of the English landscape in the Tudor age had their own labels for the two landscapes. The central province of big villages, Rackham's planned countryside, was originally called the Champion, after the wide open arable fields found there. The area of dispersed settlement, Rackham's ancient countryside, was called the Woodland. That did not of course mean that it was entirely wooded, but referred to the more bosky nature of the land, with its many hedges and woods providing a source of fuel and building materials. One of the biggest differences between these two countrysides for most of the last millennium was the dominance of the central or champion lands by large, open, arable fields. In some cases, these fields expanded to fill the majority of the land farmed from each village. In its simplest form, the open field system involved dividing the arable land into 2 or 3 large fields. Each year, one of these would be left uncultivated to improve soil fertility and provide limited grazing for animals, with a fallow field changing annually. To offset the loss of permanent pasture, open field areas often set aside some land to be used as hay meadows. This was a system where the community as a whole made decisions about what to grow and when. To ensure every farmer had a fair share of land in the system, the arable fields were divided into a multitude of individual narrow strips. Each farmer held strips scattered across the open fields, ensuring no individual was left with an excess of poor quality or fallow land. The result was a complex set of intermingled landholdings that proved resistant to later attempts to unpick it. It was only in the late 18th and early 19th century that much of the system was disbanded, often requiring an act of Parliament to force the enclosure and reallocation of land. These acts usually resulted in the former open fields being divided into entirely new regular fields defined by ruler straight hedges, lines that had, quite literally, first been drawn on a map. In contrast, in the ancient or woodland countryside, it is thought that arable fields traditionally formed part of a smaller, central infield, belonging to a single farm or hamlet, surrounded by outer fields mostly devoted to pasture. That said, despite the name Rackham gave it, ancient countryside did change through time, and the medieval open field system also emerged in parts of these areas, but to a lesser extent. Open fields here tended to cover a smaller area and involve fewer landholders than in the champion lands. They also had a shorter lifespan, typically starting later and being extinguished by enclosure at an earlier stage. That process of enclosure in the ancient countryside was different too. Here, it involved a gradual process, with agreements between individual landowners to sell or swap lands, allowing fields to be enclosed piece by piece. The hedgerows created in this process often had curving or stepped profiles as they navigated their way round remaining parts of the open arable strips. So we've seen that there was a big difference between the two English landscapes of the past. The Champion became dominated by open arable fields, whilst elsewhere hedged fields and woodland remained more common. We might then ask, when did this situation first arise? Determining when open fields initially developed in the Champion countryside of central England is not as easy as dating the rise of villages, and the answer remains a matter of debate. However, in broad terms, the most likely period for the emergence and growth of open fields is roughly the same as for the villages they surrounded. In other words, starting in the late Saxon period, or perhaps a little earlier in some places, and growing to their fullest extent in the high medieval period. Finding archaeological evidence for the introduction of open fields is far from straightforward, but there do appear to be examples where late Saxon and medieval open fields expanded into areas where the farms and hamlets of the Middle Anglo-Saxon period had been abandoned. As for documentary evidence, the surviving records from the late Anglo-Saxon age rarely dealt with the day-to-day processes involved in farming life, but if we read between the lines, we can discern that the great contrast between Champion and woodland England had started to develop by this time. By far the most comprehensive record of the English landscape in this era comes from the very end of the Anglo-Saxon period, in the Domesday Book, prepared on the orders of William the Conqueror. The interpretation of this great survey is not straightforward, but it seems clear from its pages that the distribution of land uses, such as woodland and meadow, already showed a contrast, with meadow more common in the Champion or planned lands, and woodland more extensive in the ancient countryside. Another set of records with something to tell us about this question are Anglo-Saxon charters. These were the records of grants, sales and swaps of landed estates made by kings to the nobles and churches of early England. They date from the 7th century onwards, but are particularly plentiful in the 10th century, with many grants containing detailed descriptions of the boundaries of the land they conferred. These so-called perambulations are full of local topographical detail. Analysis of them indicates that open field features such as headlands and furrows were already more common in the Champion lands, whilst those representing hedges or woods were more frequent in the ancient countryside. Lastly, the contrast between Champion and woodland England is also woven into the fabric of our countryside in the form of the names given to many of the settlements that survive today. For example, place names ending in Lee or Hurst typically come from Old English words for woodland or clearings within woodland. Such names are found more frequently in the ancient or woodland countryside of the southeast and north and west of England. In some cases, for example those ending in Lee, their earliest appearance in the documentary record suggests that they were mostly coined between the mid-8th and mid-10th centuries AD. In other words, the distinctive nature of woodland England was, to some degree at least, already noticeable more than 1,000 years ago. There are some suggestions that this variation in woodland might date back even further, perhaps as far back as the Roman period. It looks then as if the modern divergence between the two countrysides of England, both in terms of settlements and landscape, was already well underway, if not yet fully formed, by the late Anglo-Saxon period. That prompts two final questions. Why and how did this contrast come about? Why was it that some areas retained a dispersed settlement pattern with plentiful access to woodland and pasture throughout the medieval period, whilst other areas developed nucleated settlements and large open arable fields, coming to rely upon meadowland and crop rotation to provide fodder for their animals? Well, it's fair to say that if one delves into the academic literature on this subject, the ideas will come at you thick and fast. Much of the debate revolves around the extent to which this change in part of England was caused by environmental or human factors. As with any complex change in human behaviour, it is likely that a range of factors were at play, their importance varying from place to place. If we had to attempt a summary of the underlying factors at play, we might say that the period from around 800 to 1200 AD was a time of warming climate, with a growing population fed by an increase in land used for arable agriculture. In some areas of central England, soil conditions offered relatively short windows for ploughing, which encouraged people to organise the farming of expanding arable fields in a more communal way. That required agreement on crop rotations, as well as the grazing and overnight folding of livestock. As the arable grew, the communal cultivation of meadows for hay also became important in areas that lacked access to plentiful common pastures and wood pastures. This highly organised, community-based way of farming also worked best when farmers lived close to each other in settlements that grew into villages. This scenario still leaves many issues unresolved. Was the change to a new way of farming and living together a gradual process or a rapid one? Was it done on the initiative of peasant farmers or their manorial lords? And which, if either, came first, the new nucleated settlements or the new open fields? The answers to these questions is probably different in different places, and reminds us that much remains to be understood. That brings us to some final reflections. Firstly, it's worth remembering that this divergence into two broad types of countryside was not unique to England and can also be seen in many parts of continental Europe. For a good example of this divide, witness the contrast between the hamlets and hedged bocage landscape of Brittany and much of Normandy with the more open lands and larger villages of the Paris Basin. The factors that created England's Great Divide were also, it seems, at work across much of Europe. We should also acknowledge that, though we have explored the division between two general types of English countryside, there is still much variety to be found within each of them, at both the regional and local level. Some areas display a mixture of both types, and it's for that reason that not every study agrees on exactly where to draw the boundaries between them. For any individual settlement or parish, knowing its place on the spectrum between the planned and ancient countryside can be an important first step in understanding its history, but not, of course, a substitute for more detailed local research. That's because every place has its own unique character and story through time. So, the next time you gaze upon the English landscape of today, it's worth remembering that it is the product of a deep history, one with periods of both great stability and great change. The last century in particular has seen some rapid alterations, with the historical character of some landscapes being masked and modified by the growth of housing, changes to farming practices, and more recently, new uses for former farmland. In the midst of these changes, we should recognise that the English countryside itself is one of the richest and most precious historical records we have of the story of past human endeavour. It's not just fields and farms, woods and lanes, but a living map to the past. If we can learn to read it in this way, it will surely help us to understand what is at risk of being lost and how best to protect it for the future. And finally, if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel to be notified when new videos from Deep Down History are released. Until next time, cheerio.